was only 7 months old, and this doctor made it seem like he would never really do much of anything.
The two of us just started crying. We were just devastated.
The experts believed he would never accomplish anything. The doctors said he would never talk.
Transliteration. Let's hear it.
He was determined to prove them wrong.
Think about you not being able to talk.
He was just being honest, and he was speaking from his heart.
Tonight, Miles's Bar Mitzvah, one young man's journey. In many ways, tonight's broadcast is a classic in the truest sense of the word. It deals with timeless themes found in stories from the Bible on. Coming of age, epic struggle, and the power of faith. This is the story of a bright boy trapped in a body he cannot control. A boy intent on becoming a man in the eyes of his religion. His name is Miles Forma. He has cerebral palsy, a chronic disorder impairing control of movement. It afflicts more than 500,000 Americans in vastly different ways. In the case of Miles, it means he can communicate and think well enough to learn scripture in the original Hebrew, yet he cannot walk or talk. And here's where faith comes in. Miles was determined to complete his bar mitzvah, the Jewish ritual in which a boy comes of age before his congregation. At times, his journey is difficult and painful to watch, so just imagine what it was like for him. Here's Nightline correspondent Dave Marish.
This is the story of a bar mitzvah, Miles Forma's bar mitzvah.
Good morning.
Don't ham it up or anything.
There's something about Miles's face and his eyes that have always been charming. The impishness, the liking the world to be funny, liking attention.
Oh my God, I don't know this young man. Who is that handsome young man?
He's a very typical 14-year-old who is trapped inside a very untypical body. And he's at times at war with himself over this issue.
And then you can also see Miles, the child that has cerebral palsy, with flailing arms and trying so hard to position himself to reach something or to try to form a sound.
Miles, introduce me to Miles Forma. What are the most important things I need to know you?
I have CP. I am 14.
14?
I
have Dad, Mom, and Sister Josefa.
And you have a family.
High five. Good man.
Fact 2 about Miles's life, that he was 14 and not 13 at his bar mitzvah, was the only concession made to fact 1, that Miles Forma has cerebral palsy. Fact 3, that Miles has a family, shapes this whole story.
This is not possible yet for him.
Like that?
He doesn't have the balance yet. That he needs help. He needs help.
As a baby, he cried constantly, and the pediatrician would say, let him cry, and I had a feeling something was wrong.
Miles's parents, video cameraman Anthony Forma and medical administrator Betty Weimersheimer.
And it wasn't until we went to California to visit Anthony's parents, his stepfather's a pediatrician, and who took one look at Miles and knew something was wrong.
What was wrong? The diagnosis was cerebral palsy.
I remember after we spoke to the pediatrician, going out in the car with Miles and putting him in his infant seat and And I think the two of us just started crying as we were driving back. We were just devastated.
I mean, he was only 7 months old, and this doctor made it seem like he would never really do much of anything.
This was a prognosis the Formas would not accept.
Here we go. That's it. That was fast. Did you see that?
Yes.
I found the best therapists I could find, the best speech therapists, early intervention programs, and thus began a round of constant doctors and therapists and people in and out of our house, but that's what we had to do to help him reach his potential.
Good reaching. Oh, Miles.
Experts came and went, and Tony and Betty stayed on a job of childcare that sometimes felt like a black hole just devouring everything.
I mean, it took a long time to feed him and do it properly and try to get him to use his muscles properly.
Well, I think it was hard because I was an only child for 7 years.
Also living on the edge of this black hole was Miles's older sister, Josefa.
You want a hug? The phrase I repeated when I was 7, when they brought him home, was that my mother was his feeding machine. My father was just there to carry him around the apartment to keep him from crying, and I was just a speck of dirt.
The family's focus on Miles's potential produced a major life change 3 years later. The Formas moved to Budapest, Hungary, to enroll Miles in the unique program of the Peto Institute.
It was just extraordinary what we saw there.
Their approach was very, I guess you could say it was holistic. Whereas in the United States, Miles had his speech therapist, he had his physical therapist, he had occupational therapist. There they combine it all in sort of a generalist who tries to coordinate all of those different disciplines.
They didn't have wheelchairs, they just used slatted chairs and stools and tables, and the children were expected to move their bodies themselves. The idea was to retrain the pathways of the brain so the child learns how to move in the correct manner or to build up their muscles. They spend hours working with these children, and there's such a love of what they're doing and dedication that we hadn't seen something like that before.
But after 4 years in Hungary, Miles could neither walk nor talk.
We had a child who, his way of communicating at that point in time when he came back to the United States was throwing temper tantrums.
Miles was almost 8 when the Formas returned to America and found at Queens College Catherine Constable and Arlene Kratt, teachers of communication.
You could see immediately that Miles was a smart boy that had a lot of ability. He understood everything people were saying to him. Matter of fact, he understood Hungarian and English. But his way of speaking was, this is yes, and that was no. Facial expressions, trying to point to things.
To get beyond pointing, Miles needed words, needed to read words and to write them, even if speaking them would always be beyond him.
He very much wanted to talk, he very much wanted to learn, and he was having a lot of difficulty, but clearly creative, clearly learning to ask more kinds of questions.
One of the very first questions that Miles asked when he was learning to ask questions on his own out of the blue, I remember him turning to me one day and saying, "Are you Jewish?"
Miles, when did you first understand that you had different abilities and different problems from many other people?
I
Was?
11.
11.
When he reached about 10 or 11, when he was here, and his consciousness of himself changed, he began seeing his limitations. His limitations not only now, but his limitations lifelong.
He wants to be independent from his parents, and he can't.
And what happened to make you understand this? I-S-T-A-R.
To think.
You started to think about who I am.
Happy birthday, Yosef. And happy birthday to Yosefa.
Yosefa's boyfriend, Brian, who Miles is very close to, Miles would get very depressed about having cerebral palsy, and he would talk to Brian about it. And at one point, Brian said to him, have you ever tried just praying to God? And I think that put the germ in Miles' head. And then Joey's bar mitzvah came, and I think it sort of grew from that.
Joey Stulberg, who also has CP, is the friend who invited Miles to his bar mitzvah.
What did you think when you watched Joey be bar mitzvahed? It
made me
feel like I wanted to do the same thing.
Soon, Miles was attending religious school at Temple Beth El in New Rochelle, a New York City suburb near where the Formas live.
He wanted to know why we celebrate Shabbat, why we're Kippah. He was so interested because he came to us with no knowledge.
And my problem was to try to slow him down because he wanted to know everything right away. Right away, he wanted to know everything.
He does.
What was the hardest part of preparing for the bar mitzvah? What was the most difficult part?
There
was
no
there was no hard part. Aha.
That's interesting.
Learning Hebrew is one thing, but taking possession of a bar mitzvah Torah text and then performing it and all the other bar mitzvah rituals involves many more things. The province of Professor John Bryson Eulenberg.
Very good. Miles has cerebral palsy. He is not able to control his organs of speech. Another Sheva, the vertical two dots. And even though with his biological voice he can't do the chanting, he can, with his body and with his determination, give voice, once again, in this year, to sounds that were heard 1,000 years, 2,000 years ago. This is the Hebrew text which Miles Forma has typed in.
Dr. Eulenberg's weapons, computers and keyboards, take Miles's bar mitzvah text and speech and turn them from ideas to words.
Part of my agreement with Miles when we started was that every Hebrew word that he put in would be put in by Miles. And also every word would be one that he would learn. He would know the meaning of every word in the Torah portion and also in the blessings and prayers. This needs to be translated into a form that a computer can utter. So we call that transliteration. Shema Yisrael Adonai. Now that's just in a monotone. It sounds like a talking computer.
But for a bar mitzvah, this text has to come multiply alive, not only to be vocalized, spoken, but sung.
Here we have a program that analyzes the melody. Well, we can actually now hear that song. Let's hear it. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. And the result is something we hear, and it sounds like somebody singing. And what is being sung is a traditional melody.
Now again here, the melody is traditional, but the cadence, the emphases, that's Miles.
Yeah, that was Miles' cadence. That's true. He put his own personal flair into that particular interpretation.
I'd ask the congregation to please rise and...
Just as any bar or bat mitzvah boy or girl would, it has the singer's own special way of singing it. And this, of course, comes from the mind through the hand of Miles Forma.
For the bar mitzvah boy, there are two main parts to the performance. The reading of this week's holy text from the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and the Devor Torah, a commentary on the text, a statement on life. When it was time for the Devor Torah speech, Miles had a request.
He asked Anthony and I to go sit down. He wanted to be up there by himself, and he was very composed. He wasn't nervous.
I think that it didn't really faze him to be up in front of all those people, and he didn't seem self-conscious about himself or his disability or what he was doing or how he sounded.
My bar mitzvah takes place during the holiday of Sukkot.
He had a beautifully written speech. I think the reason why it was so beautifully written and so poetic and philosophical and spiritual all at the same time was just because he was just being honest. And he was speaking from his heart and from who he really was.
Like the Israelites on the desert, I don't know what will happen to me in the future. Sometimes, when I am really depressed, when I feel helpless, I pray to God to tell me what my future will be like. God never answers me. He knows I know the truth. The truth is, I have to deal with the cerebral palsy, and that will give me a better future. When I was 11, I started to think about God. Why did God give me cerebral palsy? I did not have an answer.
He actually made one little mistake, and in the past, if that had happened, he would have gotten frustrated and angry, and he just kept going, and no one knew he made. I didn't know he made a mistake.
I knew.
Anthony knew.
That was the highlight of the bar mitzvah for me. There's a point where you can see where he brings his hand to his cheek, and he said one part out of turn. He realized that. As Betty said, instead of getting upset or hitting it or getting frustrated, he maintained his composure, and that was great.
Think about you, not being able to talk. How would you feel?
My one favorite moment was when he asked a question and he paused and he sat, when he told people to think about something, just think about it.
Think about having to use a Dynavox and a board with words and letters to communicate. And think about that you are smart like me. I want you to just think about it for a minute.
And he just looked out with a smile at everyone as if to say, so are you really thinking about this?
I want you to try to understand, because I am very, very frustrated all the time. I dream someday I will talk, I will get married, and have a wife, and have annoying kids, like my mother and father. And I want people to respect me for who I am, not feel sorry for me because I have cerebral palsy. Finally, I would like to thank my whole family.
At one point, Miles's parents spoke from the altar directly to him.
When you were very young, 7 months old, we took you to see a doctor, a specialist, because you were having trouble holding yourself up and moving and reaching the milestones that children your age normally did. The specialist examined you, and she told us you had cerebral palsy. And then she told us something very difficult. Because of the cerebral palsy, you would never be able to do anything in your life, and that we would have to bring the world to you.
But Miles, that doctor got it all wrong. You have shown today only a small part of what you're capable of doing. And if you think about it, all your life, you have been bringing the world to us. Thank you for being who you are.
The story of Miles Forma's Bar Mitzvah. I'm Dave Marish for Nightline in New Rochelle, New York.
I'm Chris Bury in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.